Welcome to the Oundle Festival of Literature's first webinar. My name is Helen and I'm the Festival Director. At our festival we have events throughout the year and you can sign up to receive our newsletters to find out what is coming up on our website at oundlelitfest.org.uk. The event this evening is dedicated to all the wonderful sewers out there who have given of their time and skills over the last 10 months to producing scrubs, bags, masks and whatever is needed for our wonderful NHS staff. If you have been part of this amazing effort, then thank you very much. And those of us with less skill and less time salute you. Just before we begin, for those of you who have perhaps not been on a webinar before, can I just mention a couple of points? It would be lovely to hear where you are from and if you agree or disagree about something. So please use the chat facility to say hello and air your thoughts. There will be a question time towards the end of the talk, so if you'd like to ask a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. Welcome to everybody that's joining. It's lovely to see you all. Our guest tonight is Clare Hunter, and she will be talking to me about her first book. Welcome, Clare. It's lovely to see you.
It's lovely to see you, Helen, and thank you for inviting me.
Threads of Life is Clare's first book. This book was a Sunday Times bestseller, a BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week, and it was the joint winner of the Saltaire First Book Award and Waterston's Scottish Book of the Month. Threads of Life is a fantastic book, full of numerous facts and stories packed into every chapter, and has an amazing cover with embossed paper, which makes the book itself look like a work of art. You must feel very proud of it.
Well, I am very proud and, of course, very lucky to have had such good publishers and editors who took such time with it and helped me through the whole process.
When you first had the idea of the book, did you know which subjects you wanted to include, and did it turn out as you planned, or did you find that as you researched you kept finding intriguing stories that you thought, I must include that one?
Well, it's interesting because actually I did the book as part of a dissertation. I was doing a MA on creative writing practice at the University of Dundee, and as I didn't have inside me that great crime novel, I thought, what will I write about for my final, dissertation? I thought, well, actually, I've spent my life in textiles as a community arts textile artist and a banner maker. And I thought, what I'd really like to do is write a book about why people sew. And so I did the first 3 chapters just for that dissertation. And my tutor said, you should turn this into a book. And at that stage, of course, because of a lifetime in textiles and because I created exhibitions, I thought I knew a lot. And I went back to things that I knew about, and then I started research. And of course, I then discovered I knew very, very little. And I then had to start to do really proper, serious research and unearthed through that all sorts of stories, which I had no idea about.
Yeah. How long did it actually take you to write the book? And how did you go about doing the research for the lesser known things? Did you have some good contacts, and did you have to travel, for example?
All those things, Helen. I think it was a Sherlock Holmes task, because obviously what I was trying to find out was stories of sewing that weren't known in the main, and unearth, a very kind of unusual or moving or poignant stories that perhaps had been very much hidden. And so while I looked at lots of books about needlework, then most of those books deal with technique. And perhaps deal with, if they're books about different kinds of ethnic embroidery, might deal a little bit with the social context with that, but not really about the people who made them and why they made them and the impact they had and the social reasons they were doing it. And so to get that, I then, as you say, went to see different people who had more knowledge than me in things like the Quilt Museum, which was there in York, to find out what they thought about why people made different kinds of sewing. And also I then, of course, the wonderful thing we have now is Google, and I must have Googled in all sorts of different variations on political sewing, community sewing, people sewing, men sewing, anything I could think of to try and unearth little nuggets of information. And through those little nuggets, I could maybe get an email, and then I could contact that person and I could find out more. Some stories, however, I never found out more than just the name of them or a tiny bit of background, and therefore they couldn't be included in the book because a lot of it isn't documented.
Yeah, yeah. No, well, you obviously did a fantastic job, because I mean, it's absolutely packed full of different facts, and you must have really sort of gone into depth with some of them. So
yes, and I think the thing was that sometimes you had to, leave out things that you discovered that just didn't fit into the kind of pattern of the book. And it did take 3 years. I mean, it was 3 years of researching and writing and rewriting to actually complete it as a final piece of work.
And as a first-time author, did you get a lot of help from somebody at the publishing house to sort of say, you've done too much on that, or you've not done about enough on this? Did they help you?
Well, when I actually got a publishing deal, which of course was fantastic in itself, I thought I'd be, basically brought down to London, taken out, wined and dined over a very nice dry Chardonnay, and we would discuss whether this paragraph should go there, or that title, of that chapter could possibly be renamed. And in actual fact, what I got was teacher's notes from a wonderful editor called Juliet Brooke, and basically she was fantastic, because what she really was trying to help me to achieve, which hopefully she did, was to bring out a book that had more muscle, that wasn't just the stories. Well, I had written the stories of the people, but sometimes she'd say, well, that isn't telling me anything about needlework. Why have you chosen that example? What is it you're trying to say here? What is the point?
So she gave you direction.
Yes, and so her great phrase was, what is the analytical point here? And it became a catchphrase in our house. If my husband Charlie was making a sandwich, I'd say, what's the analytical point here, Charlie? And Juliet laughs about that now. But it was fantastic for me to have that kind of somebody with real rigor and real curiosity pushing me on to find something further that would really interest people.
Well, it's obvious that you have a real love and respect for needlework and sewing and what it can achieve and bring to people. How were you first introduced to it?
Well, I was first introduced, as I think most people were, by my mother. I was quite a kind of active child, over energetic. She had other children. I was quite talkative, asked lots of questions. And I think she thought, that girl needs something to steady her mind and her hands and, in a sense, keep her out of my way for a while. And so she took me to a little craft shop in Glasgow and let me loose. And in those days, you could buy those little printed linen cloths that would have like cheval sets and antimacassars and things like that, and then let me choose from the fantastic carousel of colours that you get in embroidery threads. And I came home with that, and she just taught me. She wasn't an embroiderer herself. She just taught me basic stitches: lazy daisy, fern stitch, blanket stitch, a few stitches. But when I actually started on doing it, I just found it so absorbing. And I think as a child, I was quite young, I was 5 or 6. I think I found it quite miraculous that you could take a plain piece of cloth and with just a needle of thread, transform it into something that was so lovely.
Yes.
And so I fell in love with embroidery at that point, and have embroidered ever since.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I remember my mum giving me a little box with buttons in and spending time arranging the buttons.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. You start the book with a chapter entitled Unknown, and yet it's about the most famous tapestry in the world. For people who haven't yet read the book, this may seem a bit of a contradiction, but can you explain what you're actually referring to with Unknown?
Well, with Unknown, I start with visiting the Baya tapestry, and Mark, if you wouldn't mind, you could put up that image of the Baya tapestry. And basically I started with that because partly it was unknown to me, in that I'd gone to see it, I'd seen it in books, but I'd never actually then gone to see it in person, as it actually looked. And so I went to the Baya Museum, and I was absolutely astonished by the needlework in it. I was astonished by its presence. I hadn't expected something so vivid and that's so well animated. The tragedy of war and the sense of people's stories within that. And what I would want to do with that chapter was also talk about the people that sewed and why it was we didn't know their stories. And what I discovered when I went to see the Bayeux Tapestry, which is, although it's got a great exhibition and a fantastic film about the Battle of Hastings itself, which is what the Bayeux Tapestry depicts, then it didn't actually talk very much about the woman who had sewed it. And so there we were again with a group of anonymous sewers who had created, as you say, this most famous, most celebrated piece of needlework, one of the most celebrated in Western Europe in medieval times. And what actually is the story of the Bayeux Tapestry was that, again, it became lost. So for the first 500 years, it was hardly seen.
Yes, yeah. I mean, one of the things that came out of reading that chapter to me was I didn't realise that they only had 4 different colours, lots of hues, but only 4 colours.
Only 4 colours, and the different hues of dye that they could get from those colours. And what they did very cleverly, which again, until you actually see it, you don't really appreciate, is that they might use the horse's legs. You can see there on the left of the screen where you've got, you know, the foreleg in the lighter beige and the back leg in a darker brown. And that was really to bring energy to the piece, to get this sense of movement. So they deployed their colours so craftily in order, as I say, to really bring alive what they were depicting.
Yes, yeah. I mean, one of the themes in the book that appears time and time again is that beautifully sewn pieces of work, often made by women, are not treasured and valued as they should be. And this is even true of the Bayeux Tapestry. I mean, when you went to see it, it was beautifully displayed in France, but it hadn't been treated particularly well in the past, had it? And it had been used for several different things.
It had. So, as I say, for its first 500 years, it was only seen maybe once a year at a Feast of Relics in Bayeux Cathedral. And apart from that, it was unknown. And then in the 18th century, during the French Revolution, then it was commandeered, or nearly commandeered, as a cover for a military wagon and saved. And a couple of years later, it was people thought, oh, that bit of old cloth would do very nicely to cover a float that they were doing for a carnival, for the goddess of reason. And then in the Second World War, then Himmler, Heinrich Himmler, basically decided that it would be very good to become part of the collection of Germany, and he then tried to get it out of France. And actually it was saved by the French resistance.
Yeah.
So it's had a very checkered history. And what's wonderful about it is that over its 900 years, which is how old it is, it has got many, many hundreds of darns and mendings that people over the years have tried to safeguard it and treasure it. And you can see that those other hands through time and the care that they've tried to take of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Did it live up to your expectations when you first saw it?
I was absolutely astonished when I saw it. I mean, mostly because it's beautifully presented. So it's like going into a river of textile, because it's a narrow piece of work, but it does wrap around this entire huge room. Excuse me. And your eye is drawn to so many things within it. What is amazing is, although it in itself it is so vast as a piece of work in terms of its length, then your eye is drawn to some of the tiniest pieces within it. And that's again because the needlework. So you might find, you know, just the hem of a gown, or a stilled, you know, there's a wonderful bit of a picture of milk or ale being poured out, and the stilled liquid, you know, just the cleverness of it, the artistry in it is extraordinary.
The idea of a tapestry to tell a story has been replicated many times, and you yourself were involved with one of these projects, the Great Tapestry of Scotland. How are you involved, and where can this tapestry now be viewed?
Well, I was involved because I'm involved with, now it's friendship, but basically in Glasgow's Year of Culture in 1990, we did a big project in Glasgow called Keeping Glasgow Stitches, and a group of that involved over 600 people. But there was a group of women who had been involved in that project who stayed together and worked with me on various other community projects over the next years and became known as the Thursday Group or the Glasgow Banner Group. And when the Great Tapestry happened, they said, why don't we, because you asked if you could do a panel, and they said, why don't we ask if we can do a panel? And they gave us not the most fascinating subject, they gave us football as our theme, and basically we posted it to one another, and we all did our various footballers and bits and pieces. And that group has now been meeting for over 25 years.
Wow.
Which is great. We meet now socially as friends. We don't have sewing projects to do together, but we meet socially as friends. So it was lovely for us to have that, is in a sense, that final piece of collective work that we did together on the Great Tapestry of Scotland, which is an extraordinary piece of work.
Yes, yeah. I think that's what often happens within sewing groups. You know, you might meet to sew a particular project, but very often you end up making really good friends and carry those forward with you.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the wonderful thing about sewing is that usually in those sewing projects, then, you know, you have your head down sewing. And so it's much easier to share intimacies when you're not doing eye-to-eye contact.
Yes.
As we all know, for those of us that have had teenage children, much easier to talk in the car, you know, and it's
going
the same
for a
with
walk
sewing.
or something, yes.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, in Frailty, chapter 3, you give many examples of how sewing can be used as a healing craft and allow vulnerable people to express themselves, such as the mentally ill patients and men suffering with post-traumatic stress disorder. Why do you think that sewing helps these people, many of them who might not have experienced sewing before?
Well, I suppose it's two things. I think one thing is just the rhythm of sewing. You know, when you sew, particularly if you're doing embroidery, then it requires absorption.
Yes.
And it also requires, it also lets you find a rhythm in your own hands. And that rhythm, once you've found your own, everybody's rhythm is different, as it is knitting or other crafts. Then once you've found your rhythm, then it's very soothing, of course, to just stay within that rhythm. And there's also the tactility, I think, of having the softness of cloth.
Yes.
You know, and the feel of things, just the tactile feel of cloth and thread is in itself, you know, that's why children carry around their comfort blankets.
Yes.
You know, in a sense, sewing allows you to still have a comfort blanket on your lap.
Yeah. I mean, you talked about working with a group of men in the hospital, designing and making curtains for the hospital cafe. And at first they were a little bit reticent, but then they got very involved in it, didn't they?
They did, and there they were a group of men who had various mental illnesses, and so they were socially kind of vulnerable, and so it was difficult for them to not just communicate with themselves, but communicate with me. And through that sewing project, we're just seeing here now one about the First World War, because during the First World War, the soldiers that came back from that war with shell shock and tremors and many physical disabilities, then became involved in many different embroidery projects. If we just go back to the previous slide, Mark, for a minute, we can see that actually this is one of the soldiers' embroidery. It was called the Disabled Soldiers Embroidery Industry, and that was started up by, surprisingly, an actor called Ernest Thesiger, who some might know, who was the kind of maniacal scientist in The Bride of Frankenstein. And although he was known, excuse me, for his portrayal of madmen and murderers, he was also known for his embroidery. And he actually enlisted into the First World War and eventually was injured and came home and decided that he would use his embroidery to try and help those disabled soldiers who, like him, had been through such trauma and had come home, and many of them in convalescent hospitals or indeed stuck at home, had no means to earn an income or indeed to carry on having an active involvement in life. And through their embroidery, many of it commissioned by royalty or by very prestigious places, he then found them a way of them rediscovering a sense of achievement, of ability, and then in terms of the embroidery itself, they also found medically that it was very efficacious for both their mental and physical well-being, because, as I say, through the rhythm of embroidery, they find a way to stabilize their minds as well as their hands.
I know that Ernest himself, he was actually injured during the war and his hands were damaged. Do you know if he learnt embroidery before the war?
He was already an embroiderer. Yes.
Oh, right. Yes.
Yes, he was very given to petit pois and gros pois in terms of sewing. And of course, it was an unusual thing, but he just delighted in it. And you can actually see a little video of him on YouTube when he did a broadcast, I think in the 1930s, where he's sitting with embroideries around him in very elegant and just talking about his embroidery. Yes.
Yeah. And he had a very posh title, didn't he?
He did, because with the Disabled Soldiers Embroidery Institute, they called him a secretary, honorary secretary cross stitch, which I think is a great title to have.
Yeah, brilliant. Oh.
And of course, actually, when he went to the War Office with this idea of introducing soldiers to embroidery, they laughed him out, of course. They said it'd be far too effeminate. Men wouldn't be interested in doing that. But actually, he persisted, and the War Office eventually supported it. And of course, why men did take to it so much was because many of these men had been craftsmen. Yeah. They had been joiners. They had been, people working with glass. They'd been people who'd been working with their hands. And so to transfer that skill to a more sedentary skill, but still artistic and creative, was something that they were well used to. Yeah. And they didn't find it effeminate.
Yeah, yeah. In chapter 4, Captivity, you wrote, sewing is unobtrusive. It can be done in company. It can be done secretly, quickly folded away should the need arise. During the Second World War, women in a prison in Singapore turned to sewing. Can you please tell us about the women in Changi prison?
I can do. The women in Changi prison in Singapore, basically they then, during the Second World War, captured by the Japanese and then forced to do a march from Singapore to the Changi prison. If you would do the next slide, Mark, there. And basically, it's not a well-documented story what those women went through in their time in Changi. But they did take up sewing. There's many examples of signature quilts and other things they did to then basically keep alive their sense of self and the sense of identity. One of the things that they did was make a quilt, ostensibly to as an act of assistance to prisoners who were in the hospital. As an innocuous way of getting past the guards, the Japanese guards, messages to their loved ones. Yeah. And so they sewed 3 quilts, which were autographed by them. And basically they then sewed on them images of hope, of perseverance, of spirit, of patriotism, of home, all these different images. They are signed by them. And one woman also made a sewn tray cloth, which actually on it she embroidered the arrival of the prison of the women at Changi prison, and it's possibly the only documented evidence we have of that experience of those women's arrival there.
I was quite shocked the way that came to light, that piece of material, because it was actually found at a jumble sale, wasn't it?
It was. It was found at a jumble sale in Bristol, actually, and basically it's again that sometimes poignant tale of needlework, that obviously either the person who'd made it had died, and her relatives had found it and just thought, oh, that's just an old tray cloth, and had given it to a jumble sale, and it was only there that then people recognised that it was actually a piece of really, really important war documentary. And here we're seeing one of the signature cloths that they made in Shanghai. And these signature cloths, which are, you know, were made in other prisons of war, were really this idea about people. It was partly to mark the collective experience of people who thought they were forgotten about, who didn't know if they would survive. And so they signed their names in order to register their existence, and at that point, their survival and their association and intimacy with each other. Yeah. What's interesting to me about some of the Shanghai embroideries is that they weren't sewn as any kind of jolly sewing bee. This is the tray cloth from Shanghai prison, as I say, of the women's arrival. They'll always be in England, and their first view of that prison, that they were going to spend the next 3 years in circumstances that were very grievous, with, you know, death being an everyday event, and obviously vast malnutrition and separated from their loved ones. Yeah. So there we go. So people making, what I was going to say is they didn't make them in any jolly sewing bees. They chose sewing because it offered them some privacy. And that might sound strange, because in Shanghai, which was built for hundreds of prisoners, eventually had thousands of prisoners. Yeah. And so there was very little personal space. But through sewing, because you just have it within yourself, in some ways, it gives you a chance to find a little personal space. And that's why these women used it.
Yes, yeah. I mean, even now, there's numerous sewing projects done in prisons, not in secret, but as an organised activity. Why do you think it helps prisoners these days?
Well, the wonderful Fine Cell work, which is a great organisation, it works mainly in male prisons, and basically it involves prisoners making embroideries again. It has a wonderful website, do look it up, Fine Cell work. Often witty comments on prison life and their own experiences. And again, in the main, the men work in their cells and choose to do that because it gives them respite from the clamour of prison life. And also, as we were talking about cloth earlier, you know, if you're in that kind of environment where the surfaces around you are all harsh, you're around steel and they say clang and clamour, then to sit with the softness of cloth in the peace and privacy of your own creativity, again, allows solace and peace of mind.
Yeah. In chapter 6, in Connection, this is a chapter that I personally found the most emotional when reading the book. We can all feel very connected to textiles, whether it's an item of clothing or something that a friend or a relative has made for us. It can bring back memories and feelings about that person. You went to visit the London Metropolitan Archive and the London Foundling Museum, where you looked at the billet books. Can you tell us what these books contained and how you felt about them?
Well, I'll say first of all just a little bit about quilts. I see you've got a lovely quilt behind you there, because basically what I'm talking about there is about scraps of fabric and how scraps of fabric can be both poignant individually, but also when brought together. This is an image of a quilt that I found with my husband. His aunt, who's now in her 90s actually, was lived in the house that she was brought up in with her parents, and basically she was clearing it out and she asked us to clear the attic, and we found in the attic this quilt, which is extraordinary and made of very delicate little hexagons. And I decided to count the number of hexagons in that quilt, and there were 6,000 of them. Wow. All handmade. I've actually got it here with me, but it is about this thing about scraps, because the idea of quilts like this is about the collective force, bringing together different scraps of fabric, different people to sew together, and through those means, the combination of hundreds of pieces, the combination of different hands, you bring into the piece itself a stronger spirit. And that's the idea behind quilts. And you've got one, as I say, you might like to say something about that, the one you've got behind you, Helen.
That's one that my mum made for my eldest son. And my mum will be watching, so she'll be very pleased to see it. And it's called Mariner's Compass, that pattern.
Ah,
And I'm just sort of safekeeping it until my son feels that he's ready to have it in his home.
that's lovely. That's lovely.
Yeah.
And of course, that will go on for generations. Hopefully, your
Yes.
son will pass it on through his time
Yes.
to the next generation and generation. This quilt here, we thought, oh, it's fantastic. We brought it back to our own house, and I thought, and we used it on our own bed, and we thought, you know, it's wonderful to be sleeping under the generations gone past of my husband's family. But when his aunt came to visit, I asked her about the history of the quilt, and she said, oh no, it's actually got nothing to do with family. It was given to my mother by a neighbour, and we've no idea where it came from. And so that was the kind of romance of history, how quickly dashed that can be, that we can build up, you know, stories for these things that actually don't exist. But anyway, we still feel it's got the hands of other generations, maybe not our own family, in it. And basically, in terms of the Foundling Hospital, that was about individual pieces of cloth, because there in the 18th century, then the London Foundling Hospital took in babies whose mothers couldn't look after them. And basically, you know, we're talking thousands of babies. But what they encouraged them to do over about 20 years was to leave a scrap of fabric as a memento, and also as a proof of parentage. Some mothers who left their scrap kept a bit of that scrap themselves, so it could be matched up if they came to claim it, if they came to claim their child again. And of course, what's happened through time is that it has become this extraordinary archive of 18th century fabrics, the best that is in Europe. And a lot of the fabrics are hand woven, obviously, hand dyed, because synthetic dyes weren't yet invented. And some are of the most humblest materials, but really interesting. Some of the mothers cut off from their clothing little pieces that would have a symbolic significance. So it might have a particular flower that had a meaning, or an acorn, or something else that gave across a message of love. And in some ways, what they are, hundreds of them, there were 5,000 of these scraps left over 20 years. And what they are imprints of loss for me. Just so, you know, people choosing at the minute when they had to leave their child, they then snipped something from their clothing, and which is pinned to a little kind of inventory of what the child was wearing when it arrived. And so there's basically, you know, all these little strange little biographies of children and mothers, and I felt very, I don't know what, just great sadness in a sense that I, so many centuries on, was allowed to see what those mothers had never seen, was allowed to revisit those scraps that they'd left and revisit the information about their child, which they had never seen themselves.
Yeah, I mean, the figures were distressing. You said that 16,000 children were left in the care over those 20 years, and only 152 were ever called for again.
That's right, absolutely. And of course, a lot of those mothers were leaving their children there because they just knew that their child would die if it stayed with them, because they had no means to look after them. And for those women that became pregnant at that time out of marriage, then they would have been annexed from their community, annexed from their family, and had, you know, and basically had to become itinerant, just wandering, you know, the world trying to find something to eat. And yes.
Yeah. Well, let's move on now to a slightly more cheerful subject: embroidered banners. So banners have been used from ancient Rome to lead armies into battle, and knights in medieval Europe, and the suffragettes used banners as an emotive tool of campaign in the first decade of the 20th century. Why did they embrace the banners so enthusiastically?
Well, they embraced the banners. Here we are. Here's the suffragettes. They embraced banners for a very interesting reason, because obviously, while they had tried various methods of kind of persuasion through doing different kinds of persuasive, peaceful means, they weren't getting anywhere with it. And so they eventually decided to be more forceful. But in doing that, they became accused of being desexed women who are no longer feminine. And they decided that they should actually create something, a way of demonstrating that they were capable women, widely represented throughout all stratas of society, and also that they were women. And they decided on banners as the way to flaunt and project and promote their femininity. And instead of making banners that were like the Union banners we know, that were full of kind of masculine symbols and things like that, they then decided to make banners in the most beautiful of fabrics, displaced from the drawing room to the streets, which was an audacious act for women to go out in the streets anyway in those days, and to use velvets and silks and damasks and embroider them in the most beautiful ways in symbolic imagery that would resonate with other women. And hundreds of these banners were made. And in that way, they defied the critics that they were, you know, as I say, being desexed by having political protest and action, and used their banners as a way to show that they were skilled, capable, and that they were proud of their womanhood. So extraordinary.
Yes. And touching on another part of your history, I know that women used banners at the peace camp at Greenham Common in the 1980s, and also used other textiles to get attention in other ways. Can you tell us why they did that and what message they were trying to get across?
Yes, at Greenham Common is really interesting, because obviously Greenham Common, which was the peace site that women set up against the deployment of nuclear weapons there, then basically what they did was use what I call the textiles from home. So they used sheets, they used the discarded clothing of children, they used tea towels, they used dusters, they used all sorts of things in order to emphasize the fact that it was home that they were trying to protect, that they were women who were defending their homes. And by using the textiles that related to home, they then set up this visual association. And there was a 9-meter fence around the campsite, longer than 9 meters, and basically they covered that in banners and used textiles a lot in their protest, partly because in that way textiles are such extraordinary visual exclamation marks, and they were able to draw attention to their cause in a different way through the textiles they used.
And you actually went to that camp, didn't you?
I did go to that camp, I did.
Were you drawn by the textiles or by the cause?
I was drawn by the textiles and the cause. I basically, when I got on the bus to go down to Greenham and found myself in this fantastic, gregarious concert of women, you know, singing Greenham songs, then it was fantastic to feel part of that collective movement. My great laugh there was when we got to some service station, and of course, as is normal, then the women's toilets didn't have adequate toilets to deal with such an avalanche of women, and so various women just commandeered the gents' toilets, much to the total astonishment and disbelief of men who were trying to, you know, enter it, as they had to push their way through crowds of women who were waiting outside.
I think we've all done that at theatres and places.
Yes, absolutely.
Embroidery is an ancient craft that's been practiced by men and women. However, you state that women's needlework has incrementally lost economic and cultural value through the centuries. Why do you think this has happened, and why do you think that it's still true today that women's crafts are less valued?
Well, if we start at of course, it's a long history, but I mean, we have to go back to the medieval guilds, really, when women and men were both involved in the highest examples of embroidery skills. And then when the Black Death happened in the 15th century, then the market shrank, the patrons died, there was less work, and women were pushed out of the guilds, no longer allowed to be apprentices, and then eventually no longer part of professional workshops. And also at that point, then home and work was becoming more separated, and men were the ones that went out to work in their offices and their workshops, and women were at home. And they continued to sew because, of course, until the 1850s, all sewing was done by hand. Until the needlework, until the sewing machine was invented. And so basically, while everything was being done by hand, then needlework itself moved into the home. And by being something that was seen then as more domestic, something that was done by women, while tailoring remained a profession done by men, as did much of the kind of ornamental needlework for regiments or royalty, then the idea of women's sewing became devalued and stayed devalued until really the 20th century. There were odd flare-ups of points where women would get a public airing and where their skill would be appreciated again and their artistry appreciated. And there was a big movement, particularly in Glasgow and Scotland, where I'm from, of the arts and crafts needlework movement with what we call the Glasgow Girls, a group of embroiderers there, who became known throughout Europe for their innovative embroidery when they really pushed back the boundaries. But as I say, through those centuries, needlework became associated with home and with being demure, so that's why it got those connotations of something that was actually decorative and innocuous, really.
And I mean, sewing machines started to be developed in the for industry, really, in the Industrial Revolution.
Yes, yes.
It affected the cottage industry of sewers, didn't it?
It did, Helen, and it also changed the kinds, in a sense, it created more divide between the kinds of sewing that we think about. So, as you say, sewing machines were developed for the industry, for factories, and then a singer decided that he would actually, because he wanted to put his prices up, he thought he would actually market it as a much more moneyed class. Yeah. And so he designed a sewing machine that was actually a very elegant piece of furniture, which could go into the drawing room and not just be part of the servants' quarters. And in doing that, and also by setting up what was the first hire purchase scheme, he enabled gentlewomen to have a reputable reputation as seamstresses. And so you see a whole kind of expansion of women setting up in their own independent businesses, no longer needing to marry to survive, as professional seamstresses. But as they did that, then the upper middle classes didn't want to be associated with any kind of work. So they then, took on more and more decorative sewing, making kind of fripperies. Then and that was fed by magazines of the time and books of the time. Lots of those. I've got a couple of copies of wonderful books that have got knickknacks, to make for every single surface in your home. But that was really because women didn't want to be associated with the toil of sewing with a sewing machine.
You mentioned Singer. He became very successful during the 1850s, and although his character might have left a lot to be desired, he was a marketing genius. And you mentioned that the hire purchase scheme that he invented, he was the first one really that did that. What else did he do to sort of help sort of sell his machines?
Well, he did things like, which I love, he'd set up, he'd have, department store windows set up with beautiful young women sewing very elegantly on their very elegant sewing machine. He would set up competitions of having a group of factory workers sewing by hand, as he then demonstrated that one person on his sewing machine could do what they were doing in not even half the time, less than that. And so what used to be 40 hours to make a shirt on his machine became 1 hour. The speed of it was something that he was actually marketing. Yeah. And he was very clever because he actually, while there were sewing machines before he invented the Singer sewing machine that we know about, they were very unreliable. And he then decided that rather than try and look at it as a machine, he then designed it looking at how people sewed. So he changed the mechanism to replicate more closely how we actually sew. And that's what made his machines efficient. And through the efficiency, he then found a market, as you say, worldwide. Yes. And became, a millionaire, multimillionaire.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of companies now that sell sewing machines, and I've actually bought my daughter a sewing machine for Christmas.
Oh, that's lovely.
So it's still carrying on.
Yeah, still carrying on. And actually, there's been a whole kind of expansion and acceleration of people buying sewing machines during lockdown,
Yes.
which is, partly, as you were saying at the start, because people have taken to trying to support the NHS by making masks and scrubs, etc. But also because they're rediscovering their own creativity.
Yes. Well, I think people have had a lot of extra time that they weren't expecting, and it's been a great opportunity for lots of people.
Absolutely, absolutely, Helen.
Yeah. So the last chapter in the book is entitled Voice, and it's a very powerful chapter and summarises many of the subjects touched upon in the book. Which of the stories that you researched had the most lasting effect upon you?
Well, that's a very hard question, isn't it? Because there are so many stories in the book, and each of them touches you in a different way. I have a particular, I suppose, feeling for one of the simplest, but in some ways for me it encapsulates what my book is trying to be about, and that's the story of Ruth First, who is an activist in South Africa during the apartheid movement. And she was imprisoned, put in solitary confinement. And in solitary confinement, she, of course, lost control of time because nothing was happening. There was nobody coming. She was not speaking to anybody, etc. And so she used the lapel of her dressing gown, as people have done through the centuries, to draw out the 7 bars of Days of the Week in black. So she'd embroider 6 and then 1 crossing them, which we know as a symbol of people's incarceration, where they do that in prison walls.
Yes.
But then what she did was sometimes she would unpick a bar or 2, and that way she regained 2 days for herself.
Okay.
Or she would maybe sew on and start into next week. And through that means, she then controlled her own time. And she talked about it later as something that saved her sense of self-control while she had no control over her life. And I find that idea very moving, that in the simplest of ways, with the simplest of materials, she had a way of salvaging her own dignity and, as I say, a sense of her own control over her own destiny.
Right, well, now I'm going to take some of the questions from the Q&A section that our audience have put forward. So I'll read you some of the questions. So Janet Prescott says, what surprised or affected you most when researching the book?
What surprised me was how many stories there were. As I say, when I started off, I thought, oh, I know quite a lot about this and there's a lot that I can write about. But every story I turned to led to another story and led to another group of people or a particular person who was using sewing as their voice, either because they didn't have a voice or because they felt that actually through the medium of sewing, they could express better what they want to talk about. So there's a story about a wonderful woman, Esther Nissendahl, who was a Polish refugee during the Second World War. And she then, 50 years after the war, decided to write or to make in appliqué the story of what had happened to her. And basically it was because fabric and embroidery could evoke much closer than writing what the sensation and the kind of the contrasts of the meadows which we grew up against the barbed wire fence of the camp that the Nazis built in their village, that kind of idea, that she felt that in texture terms, that sewing could actually evoke much more. So those stories are very moving for me.
Yes. Okay, we have another one from Linda Lane Thornton, who says, do you think that needlework and other forms of textile work are marginalised as women's work?
They are marginalised as women's work in one way. I think there is a change. Obviously, the whole movement since the 1970s, 80s, through feminism, textile art, fibre art, there's been a whole march towards getting needlework more understood and being accepted as an art form in its own right. But we have to remember that it's marginalised because of different reasons, partly marginalised because men in the Education Act of 1860 weren't allowed to sew, weren't allowed to learn sewing at school. So they were annexed from that as a medium, as many women were from woodwork and other kinds of mediums.
Yeah.
So the imbalance there isn't just because of misogyny and a male contempt for needlework. It's also because our education system has encouraged through the last 150 years for it to be seen as something that is domestic, that is something for girls that girls should do in a demure way, etc. And it's not been allowed to flourish as it could do. We're now seeing a change in that. If you again look in Google, there's lots of sewing sites dedicated to men. There's lots more confidence coming from men to share and appreciate what textiles can be and what needlework can be. So it's not something I think was done wantonly. I think it's been done through just the trajectory of history and how needlework has been used as an educational tool, particularly to smother girls' energies.
This leads on to another question from Lynn Setterington. She says, what do you think of the level / amount of embroidery craft teaching in primary schools today?
Well, Lynn Settington, if people don't know, I'm just going to say Lynn Settington is a wonderful textile artist in her own right, who does wonderful things about signatures and quilts. And I just had, she tweeted me the other day, and we hadn't been in contact for years, and I said that she actually had, at one point, was in the book, but sadly had to be edited out because her work is amazing. If anybody would like to look at what she's been doing, it is really inspirational. So basically, what I think now is that sadly, needlework in schools it doesn't exist to the degree that it could do. That's partly because of health and safety, God help us, because they don't want children to be near, difficult things like scissors and pins and needles and things that might be, used wrongly in young hands. Whereas my experience of doing projects in primary schools, and I've done many, is that actually give children the tools of needle and thread, and they are just so imaginative and so capable and so excited and so willing to use it in all sorts of degrees. So I hope, again, this experience of COVID, when people have recognised that people have really gone back to creativity, will spur people on to do more creative projects, including sewing in schools.
Well, quite a few years ago, I used to work as a teaching assistant, and I used to run an after-school club called Fabric Fun.
Oh, lovely.
We made several quilts. We entered one in one of the quilt shows. But I found that the more you expect of a child, the more it can give. And, worries about safety sometimes hold people back, but they're actually capable of doing a lot more than you think. So,
absolutely, absolutely. I've had remarkable things with children.
Yes, yes.
Just that exuberance.
Margaret Litchfield says, and I don't quite know, you might know what she's referring to. Have you seen the Alderney finale?
No, I haven't.
Do you know what that is? I
don't know.
Maybe, so Margaret, maybe you could let us know what that is, because I'm not really sure what that is. Okay, the next question, this is an interesting one. It's from Jill Morrison. Did you look at all at the Underground Railway, which I find fascinating?
Yes, I did. I looked at slave quilts, what I could look at, find about slave quilts, and I do write about the Underground Railway and the idea that quilts were used as signals to slaves trying to journey to freedom, and they were used in a coded way, partly as maps. So depending on what the patterns were, using quilt patterns very cleverly as signposts, and also used as warnings or as to indicate where shelter might be found, etc. It's not proven, sadly, but as I say in the book, we all hope that it's true.
Yes, yeah. Jenny Monroe says, what is the best lockdown sewing project you've heard of?
Oh, the best lockdown sewing project I've heard of. Well, people are making different kinds of quilts, which is lovely, and I think I just admire those people who basically have spent hours doing the most tedious of sewing, which is the mask making and the scrubs. And while there's wonderful, and I think those are great as well, textile projects going on where people are, in a sense, commemorating their experiences of lockdown through creative work. Then, we did in our own glen here in Scotland, we did bags of thanks, which were bags, laundry bags for NHS staff to put their uniforms in after work, so they could not have to handle them as much and lower the risk of their contamination. But after once I'd made my kind of, I don't know, 25th bag, yeah. Then, I really appreciated those people that stuck at it.
Yes.
You know.
John Wilson says, in Changi camp, how did the material and thread get into the camp?
Right, well, again, this is, basically they recycled fabric where they could. So they used the flour sacks or sacks that they could basically hide, used, got it from the kitchens and then hid them and reused them. And of course it was dangerous. There was a quilt made by girls who were part of a girl guide group that had been set up in the camp, and many girls didn't join that project because they were absolutely terrified of what would happen to them if it was found. They used dresses that had rotted in the sun. They would unpick the threads and the seams and then cut up the fabric. And then when the actual women started making the quilts for the hospital, then the main leader of that project was actually allowed by the Japanese officers, the camp officers, because they thought it was a good deed that the women were doing. She was allowed to go to market to buy thread, and a lot of the women at the camp thought that was a complete waste of resources, because of course they were in such dire need of medicine and other essentials. Then why would you have your limited resources used for embroidery thread?
Yes.
And that's a very difficult one to answer. What is the decisions that you make at that point? But as it was a means to keep in contact with those that women loved, their sons and their husbands and their fathers, then she felt it was worthwhile an exercise to make these quilts and get them out of their camp into the men's camp, into the men's prison.
I just saw briefly flash up in the chat, the lady that had asked about the Alderney finale. She was saying that it was a project that the women on Alderney made, but it disappeared again before I could read the whole thing. But thank you for clarifying.
Well, it might have been part of the final. There was a project, I believe, there, which again I mentioned in the book, if I've got the place right, which was basically the final panel of the Baya tapestry, which is missing.
Oh, right.
And so they made that final panel of basically the king getting crowned in Westminster and handed the keys to the city, and that was part of that. Jan, oh, I forgot her name, was the main artist part of that. Yes. Kate Russell, I think, was part of that. Yes.
Okay. Maxine Surtees says, what sewing project are you currently working on?
The sewing project I'm currently working on, well, actually what I'm working on at the moment is making toy hairs, as in like rabbits' hairs, for my great nieces. And I kind of downloaded a kit from the internet, and actually it's a great pattern and they're very comical. I've also been working on, I'll just show you because they're just sitting up at the window, I've also been working on little felt birds from another. So I've also been doing a couple of quilts, but nothing useful. I found it very difficult in lockdown to do anything particularly challenging creatively. So instead I've been doing very simple, fun things.
Yes, yeah. Sue Pearson says, hi Claire, thank you for a fascinating talk. Do you have a one all-time favourite piece of needlework, either your own or someone else's?
I have a favourite piece of needlework, and actually what it is, it's a bag, little bag that I picked up in a charity shop in Edinburgh. It's made, I think, in what I would call Ari work, i.e. it's made in with a hook, in terms of how do I describe it, in linked hoops embroidery. It's made of wool, and it's totally covered in embroidery. It's very dense embroidery, and it's the most beautiful patterning that it's flowers, but it's kind of abstract, and it's obviously done by somebody who was an artist. I've tried to find out anything more about it that I can, but apart from finding out that it's possibly Ari work, I've never found out more about it. But it's really, really exquisite, and so I love it.
Right. We'll just do one last question because we've actually almost run out of time, and this is from Jill Francis. How do you see sewing developing in the future?
How I see sewing develop in the future? Well, as I say, there's been a huge explosion in sewing in different kinds of ways. So there's been, things politically to do with the craftsmen's movement, who make kind of witty comments using different forms of needlework as a way to draw attention to different causes. There's also, in terms of that, lots of interesting things going on with mapping out things as we become more used to the idea of kind of computer printout type things. Then a lovely one I heard about was a young father who was charting the first year of his baby's sleep patterns in cross stitch, in different color cross stitch. So this idea of marking things through stitchery, I think, is quite a new one. The work that Lynn Setching does in terms of using signatures in fabric is a really interesting development. People autographing things, but in imaginative ways, to both leave their presence there, to mark their own existence, but also then to make other statements. That's very interesting. And then, of course, we've got the whole thing that's happening with smart textiles. So for medical use, or indeed for sensory use. So you've got projects where there's basically maps of cities in fabric, but where they actually are sensory, so they have sound within them, they have light within them. So there's a whole other dimensions, haptic qualities that sewing will go towards, which are going to be very, very interesting and very exciting.
And lastly, can I just ask you, because I know that you have got something in the offing, you're writing a new book at the moment. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Oh yes, well, there's a chapter in Threads of Life which is about Mary Queen of Scots. Yeah. And when I was researching that, I just became really fascinated by both her story, which I knew some of, but not all of, and also her own needlework and the textiles that surrounded her through her life in the Renaissance in France, etc. And so I decided that my next book, which hopefully is going to be called Embroidering Her Truth, the material world of Mary Queen of Scots. And I'm in the middle of writing that at the moment, so I've just got the first draft 5 chapters underway.
Yes, yeah. Well, to finish off, would you like to read the last paragraph from the book, because I think it sums up sewing very aptly and is a good way to finish.
I will, thank you, Held, I'll do that. Needlework can record history, convey complex social information about people's status, relationships, beliefs, origin, and allegiances. It can conserve memory, protecting and preserving personal and collective testimonies. It has a vital role to play in archiving tradition and telling people's stories in a medium that carries emotional and physical meaning. Fabric and thread can convey a prayer, trace out a map, proclaim a manifesto, send out a warning, bestow a blessing, celebrate a culture, and commemorate lives lived and lost. Lives expressed not just through images, but through texture and colour, different kinds of stitches, the various processes of piecing, patching, recycling, quilting, to more clearly articulate the different layers of our humanity and manifest the fabric of our lives. Sewing is a way to mark out our existence on cloth, patterning our place in the world, voicing our identity, sharing something of ourselves with others, and leaving the indelible evidence of our presence in stitches held fast by our touch.
Thank you very much, Claire. That was wonderful.
No, thank you, Helen, and thank you to everybody for coming. It's so great to see so many people tuning into something about needlework, and long may that last. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to everybody that's been watching. We've been able to see the comments in the chat, so thank you for joining in, and thank you for your questions, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I have. The book would make a fantastic Christmas present for all your sewing friends. Please do buy it from your local independent bookshop. Thank you to everybody who's made this event possible behind the scenes, and I hope that you'll join us for future events in 2021. Details of the next 2 events will appear on the screen as we finish this event. So good wishes to everybody and good night. Farewell.